Good morning. My name is Ahmad Harb, and I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to this briefing on the impact of the 2020 U.S. election results on Middle East policy. I hope I don't surprise anyone with my assumption that former Vice President Joe Biden has won the 2020 election and will assume the presidency on January 20, 2021. The United States has been a pivotal player in the Middle East since the end of World War II. President-elect Biden is no stranger to Middle East issues and policies, and in fact, has his share of some really bad policy decisions regarding the region. But next January, he takes office while the United States foreign policy is both undergoing fundamental change and suffering from serious deficits in personnel, planning, agenda, and direction. In other words, the Biden team will have their hands full trying to manage the current disarray besetting US foreign policy. Because of the traditional relationship between the United States and the region's countries, how Biden deals with the many issues of war and conflict there, authoritarianism, Israeli occupation, economic, political, and social development, and many other things, is of utmost importance to regional and international peace. To help us shed some important light on how the Biden presidency may address the Middle East and its issues, and glean how successful it could be, is a group of experts on the Middle East. Each will have about 12 minutes to present their topic, after which we will take questions from the audience. First, we will start with Sahar Aziz, who is Professor of Law, Chancellor's Social Justice Scholar, and Director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School. And she will be addressing US policy toward Egypt, human rights, and national security policy. Then we will have Nabil Khouri, who is a former diplomat who has served in the State Department and in many posts in the Middle East, and currently is non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council. And he will be discussing US policy toward Yemen and the war there, and policy toward Lebanon. Then we have Yusuf Munayir, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and host of our podcast, 5 Questions, to which I really urge you to listen. And he will talk about US policy toward Israel-Palestine and the recent normalization deals. Finally, Sarah Leah Whitson, who unfortunately is a bit detained this morning, and she will be joining us around 10:30. She is the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. And she will be discussing US relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and policy toward democracy. Please submit your questions on the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or by sending your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. That's events@arabcenterdc.org. Please also note that this event is streamed live online on our website at www.arabcenterdc.org. Dr. Sahar, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Marhaba. Ahlan wa sahlan. I'm thankful for being part of this esteemed panel, and this is such an important topic at a time when many of us want to be hopeful that there will be change. But I suspect that, like any discussion on the Middle East, there will be both optimism and pessimism. And of course, a plethora of complexity. So let me just start with a note to the American people. Dear American people, your taxpayer money has been used for over half a decade or half a century to prop up dictators that oppress, torture, and starve these citizens. These citizens are humans with the same needs, desires, and aspirations as you to live a life of dignity, material comfort, and freedom. However, your Republican presidents have admitted it is a necessary evil to support authoritarianism in the Middle East in order to preserve American hegemony, which is allegedly also necessary to ironically promote freedom and democracy in the world. Meanwhile, your Democratic presidents condemn authoritarianism and rhetorically support human rights, but continue business as usual by continuing to support the dictators. So if you read Biden's tweet in July of this year, where he issued a stern warning to Sisi, President Sisi of Egypt, saying, if elected president, there would be, quote, no more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator, end quote, in reference to Trump's remarks during last year's G7 summit. But you shouldn't believe him. You should not believe Biden, because it really is up to us as citizens and taxpayers to demand that Biden and our government do not spend our money or exercise the power that we grant them through elections to support oppressors abroad. Because having come so close ourselves to being ruled by an aspiring dictator, well, we were ruled by him, but we became very close to becoming an authoritarian state, but for our culture of democracy, protest, and our strong civil society institutions and strong government institutions. We should be even less tolerant of supporting dictators abroad. We must demand benchmarks for human rights and accountability for abuses before arms sales are conducted to authoritarian governments, including in Egypt, which is where I'll be focusing my comments today. So 3 key points I would like to highlight, or I would like to make. The first is that counterterrorism has been and continues to be and will always be a red herring that will be used to legitimize supporting dictators. And this is where the Republicans and the Democrats have a lot in common. And so with the Biden administration, you can expect all sorts of excuses of why the Leahy Act shouldn't be enforced, which the Leahy Act conditions foreign aid to countries abroad on the adherence to human rights laws. But there is a waiver provision, which is frequently and almost always exercised by the Secretary of State, such that it's in the interest of the United States' national security to waive that human rights condition. So you should expect more of that unless we speak out and we hold Biden accountable and we pay attention to these types of means in which our money is spent. The second is America's policy in Egypt and the broader Middle East is clear. Our government does not care about human rights. Trump didn't even pay lip service to it, like most of his Democratic predecessors. So we know that Biden will change the rhetoric to support human rights, and I think that's a fair bet to make. We saw it with Obama, we see it with Clinton, and arguably we even saw it with Bush to some extent, but we do not know whether Biden will actually change the policy when it comes to conditions placed on US foreign aid and when it comes to diplomatic relations. And then finally, what Egyptians and most people around the world care most about is good governance. And it is easy for us in these very privileged positions in the West where we live in comfort and we have many social services and we have good governance relative to many developing countries. It's easy for us to talk about abstract philosophical issues, but ultimately at the end of the day, what most Egyptians want, and I think what most Americans want, most citizens across the world want, is they want good governance. And I'd like to take the opportunity today and we can talk more in the discussion, to emphasize that the 2 areas where it's debilitating the society is the deteriorating education system in Egypt, which is then also contributing to the deteriorating economic conditions, which are most starkly felt by the youth unemployment bulge. So what we're seeing in Egypt today, I think, is all of the same factors we saw that produced the 2011 revolution, or one can call it a failed revolution and effectively an uprising. Many of the same conditions are there, arguably worse, because poverty has gone up from 2015, which was after Sisi took power. It was 28%, now it's 33%, and that's the government's records. So you can imagine the reality is probably more near 40%. So you're talking about 40 million to 45 million people who are living below poverty. The unemployment rate for youth is around 30%, probably more like 40%. So they are suffering economically, and at the same time, they're also suffering politically because of the repressive measures that have been underway since 2014 or 2013, with America's blessing, both under Obama and under Trump. So there isn't that much difference when you look at the actions, but there is a lot of difference when you look at the rhetoric. So just a few points, as I don't have a lot of time to go into depth, is with regard to counterterrorism, here are some ideas that are not new, but bear repeating. We need to stop selling weapons to Middle Eastern dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. They use those weapons against their own citizens. And no matter what the justification is, counterterrorism, national security, ultimately the people that they are repressing are their own citizens. And those citizens know that. And so don't be surprised when you see anti-American sentiment in the Middle East, because it is a rational process insofar as they are connecting the causal dots. Our dictator cannot stay this powerful and cannot sustain his authoritarian rule without the support politically, economically, and militarily of the United States, as well as other Western countries. So the question for us, I think, as Americans is that where we want our money and our power to be exercised, that how we want it. The second is, we learned this in 2011, and we can't seem to retain this lesson and not have to keep relearning it, which is authoritarianism produces political instability. So the entire argument, it's a complete fallacy that you have to support these dictators because they claim, of course, in a self-interested way, that if you remove me or push me out, there will be chaos, there will be instability. The choice is not simply a dictator or chaos. There are many other alternatives in the middle that can create incremental change and that can require this transition from authoritarianism to indigenous forms of democracy. And that gets me to my third point, which is indigenous democracy, and indigenous is the key point, is really, I think, the secret to the Middle East or any country thriving. And this is where the United States also, especially liberals, make multiple critical errors, where they believe the way to support democracy in Egypt, for example, or another foreign country, is to implement the American version of it. And as we know, that won't work. So we have to empower those within the society, within Egyptian society, civil society, journalists, human rights activists, lawyers, government officials who are reform-minded, to be able to have the agency and the political space to reform their system and produce the democracy that is within their own cultural norms, religious norms, political norms. And the importance is that we do not contribute to the closing of that political space, which we did when we refused to identify the removal of Morsi as a coup, when we continue to give aid despite having multiple disappearances of journalists and human rights lawyers and human rights activists who are also being tortured and who are being prosecuted on trumped up charges of national security and counterterrorism. So let me now go to the issue of foreign aid and human rights quickly. So the first, as I said before, we need to implement the Leahy Law and we need to stop giving these waivers. And this is something we can control in the United States. And this isn't just to Egypt. I don't want to pick on Egypt. As a matter of principle and as a matter of law. So we either remove that waiver legally, and Congress needs to do that, or we need to pressure Biden and his Secretary of State, whoever that will be, to stop issuing the waiver and stop compromising. Because what we're doing is we're contributing to what I think will be another revolution that unfortunately will be much bloodier than the 2011. The 2011 was miraculously a nonviolent revolution, which is a huge tribute to the peacefulness of Egyptians. I don't think many other countries could have, or many other people could have done what they did and kept it peaceful. Whatever violence there was from the state, and that's been documented. We also need to value the lives of Arab Americans who are unlawfully imprisoned in Middle East countries. And I certainly have a very personal interest in that, because what we saw is Mohammed Amesh, who languished in Egyptian prison for 486 days, Mustafa Qasim, who was not so lucky, he died from a hunger strike after spending 5 years in jail in pretrial detention, where he hadn't even been tried yet. And then when he was tried, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison on trumped up terrorism charges. We also saw Mohammed Sultan, who now heads the Freedom Initiative in Washington, D.C., spend 643 days in an Egyptian prison where he was beaten and tortured. And those are the lucky ones because they have dual citizenship and they have and they're American citizens. Egyptian citizens are left to be tortured, die from illness, rot in jail. And we've got up to 60,000 political prisoners in Egyptian jails. And so to use the language or the lingo of the day, Arab lives matter. But Arab lives do not matter to the Egyptian government or in American foreign policy. And so finally, I'll just end with a few other pointers that I think we need to consider when we are demanding of Biden to adhere to human rights. We need to end indefinite pretrial detention in Egypt. That is one way where there is legal mechanisms in Egypt which are being abused, which allows the government to detain someone without even being charged for 45 days, and then it continues to be renewed. And that goes on for 2 years, which is the limit of pretrial detention under Egyptian law. And then new charges, which were essentially based on the same underlying trumped up events, are refiled and so on. And so you have people like Mustafa Qasim, who was in jail without even going to trial for 5 years. And again, he was an Egyptian American. We also need to support independent and unannounced monitoring of prison conditions. The prison conditions in Egypt are horrendous, and anyone in Egypt who speaks out, such as Nigad al-Bur'i, who is a human rights lawyer who is now being investigated for threatening national security because he was an activist and an advocate against torture. Right? So when people on the inside, when Egyptians do it, the state is brutal, and we have to hold the Egyptian state accountable. And we also need to be part of some form of independent international monitoring system that also incorporates the Egyptians. So again, we're not engaging in cultural imperialism or legal imperialism, but we also understand that our counterparts in that country do not have the luxury of being able to fight for reforms without paying with their liberty, if not their rights. Similarly, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists, lawyers, and activists who have disappeared. They are being abducted by the state. Oftentimes, they're found based on what they post on Facebook, Twitter, and social media and the internet, because the Egyptian regime has learned, it's a very savvy authoritarian regime, a very smart authoritarian regime with a lot of experience, that but for social media, there wouldn't have been the mass mobilization on the streets. So first they mobilized online, and then that translated into mobilization on the streets. And so now everybody is under surveillance. Even if you like an article that someone else wrote or someone else posted, that could invite the scrutiny of the state and ultimately lead to worst case scenario, being disappeared, and then suddenly turning up in some jail, usually after you've been beaten, tortured, and forced into a false confession.
Sahar, if you could please wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So finally, I'll just end with just the development pitch, right? So again, we need legal reform, we need political reform, we need foreign policy reform, but we also need things that are not as glamorous, which is development. And I just want to end by highlighting the importance of education, employment, and healthcare, because that is something that is often it's often overlooked in US foreign policy circles, and education in particular is extremely important because it sets the foundation for the next generation. And so I hope that the Biden administration will pay more attention to ensuring that Egypt gets returns back to being a center of intellectualism and high quality education in the region. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Nabil, you're on. Mike.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Ahmed, for including me on this excellent panel. And let me say at the start that I agree with everything that Sahar expressed. Especially in terms of the hesitation and potential hesitation of Biden during a Biden administration. I was at the State Department in 2011 when Obama and Biden were in charge. And I recall well the hesitation to the events, to the Arab uprising. What do we do? Should we continue supporting Mubarak, or should we dump Mubarak? How do we react to events in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Libya? There was hesitation in every case. Part of it was a question of like President Obama was in his heart for revolution, for democracy in the region, but he also had to pay attention to the security establishment in the US, which considered that the collaboration with the security agencies of all the authoritarian rulers in the region was essential for counterterrorism. As Sahar said, this is always a red herring, both for the authoritarian rulers and for successive US administrations. Unfortunately, in the end, the record of the Obama-Biden team was spotty at best on that score. Still, on a happier note, I felt very happy on Saturday when it was announced that the Biden-Kamala Harris team had reached the magical 270 number in the Electoral College. I was out walking with a friend and saw all the cars driving by, tooting their horns, and people cheering and waving flags. A friend from Yemen called or texted me and said, "This sounds like a Yemeni wedding." I said, "It's actually like the streets of Beirut when Brazil wins the World Cup." And along with the World Cup, you know, the Lebanese are always split on everything. So if Brazil plays against Argentina, the Lebanese split in equal halves and they compete fiercely. They forget all the other issues they're fighting over and they start fighting over who's best, the Brazilian soccer team or the Argentinian. Moving from that segue into the election, much like an elephant sneezing in a room and everybody worrying about catching a cold, everybody around the world followed the elections here. And in Lebanon, people thought they were themselves voting. And I'm pretty sure many of them were voting one way or another. But I was surprised unpleasantly by how many Lebanese supported Trump so strongly. And when I queried some of them, it was mainly that they thought that Trump would help them get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon, much as many in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and UAE in particular, thought that he would somehow cut Iran down to size for them. And this expectation, I mean, even when people are confronted with the notion that Trump isn't really going to do that for you, but if he were to seriously try to do it, it would probably destroy the country, meaning Lebanon. And some people would say, fine, let it be destroyed, but just get rid of this group. This is a scary notion. We still have 2 months of this administration in office, and there are mysterious things happening behind closed doors, and sometimes not so mysterious in terms of what Trump, and in particular, the ideologues within Trump's administration are trying to accomplish in terms of facts on the ground in the Middle East that would be very hard for a President Biden to change. And I worry about Lebanon. I worry about Iran and what might happen in Iran. I also worry about Yemen because there's a list of groups in these 3 countries that some in the Trump administration would love to, if not get rid of, we can do something against. Now, how would Biden be different? Well, Biden has certain preferences, and his preferences are different from Trump's preferences. However, whether he is able to accomplish them or not depends on, first of all, the internal American scene, who controls the Senate, and therefore would Congress be supportive of any of Biden's preferences or not. Secondly, of course, what Trump manages to do in the next couple of months, anything that if he is able to provoke Iran enough into perhaps not an overall war, but clashes, confrontations on various fronts, that would complicate Biden's preference, which is to get back into the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and to stress diplomacy with Iran and expand the nuclear agreement into a broader understanding on the various conflict zones in the region, where Iran is opposed by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. This becomes much more complicated if Biden assumes authority at a time when there are clashes on the ground, possibly between US soldiers in Iraq and Iran-supported militias inside Iraq. That would complicate diplomatic matters indeed, and you'd sort of have to try to roll that back before you get back to the diplomatic track. The other thing, of course, is how the region reacts and whether the region is cooperative or not. We know that the region was watching carefully the election, and that there are people who are quite disappointed with the Biden victory. They would have much rather dealt with Trump as a fellow authoritarian figure and as someone who can act as an individual and reach agreements, some of them quite personal in terms of political and financial benefit. Having said all that, I think Biden will certainly start with his key priority would be Iran in the region, and would be reaching some kind of an understanding on how to get back to the nuclear agreement in a mutually agreeable way, and how to move on several issues in the region. I think starting with Iraq, where a lot of regional and international interests intersect, and where it could be a flashpoint for confrontations between Americans and Iranians. The other place where I expect Biden to focus is Yemen. I think Yemen is another one of those security flashpoints. It's also a conflict zone where Iran is involved, although not as much as Saudi Arabia and the UAE are involved, and where the administration's point of view has been to support, continue supporting the Arab coalition in their war effort in Yemen. After all, this policy started under Obama-Biden, and was continued with enthusiasm under the Trump administration. But I think Biden is coming in at a different time. This is a slightly different Biden now from previous years in terms of positions he took in the past, both on Iraq as well as on Yemen. For one thing, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Cortez, Ilhan Omar, etc., Ro Khanna in Congress. There's a strong group, many of them new in Congress, who have already proven themselves as a successful lobby within the Democratic Party on domestic issues, certainly. And I think, again, going back to Sahar, I think on human rights, This group will try to keep Biden honest on keeping or putting America on a morally consistent path in foreign policy. I trust that group, frankly, to be much more sincere on that issue than the Biden-Harris combination, but hoping for the best, I think this group, for example, on Yemen, has already succeeded in placing Yemen as one of the priorities on the Biden agenda. And the idea is that you have to put ending the war in Yemen as a top priority in the Middle East for various reasons, starting with the fact that this is the worst humanitarian disaster in the world, even going back to World War II. And that's just on a moral and humanitarian level. But in terms of stability in the Middle East, this war could expand into a broader regional war. And it is one place where a Biden presidency can prove itself in terms of showing that diplomacy can be successful and using arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE as a tool, as a leverage to get them to stop the bombardment. Of course, it takes two sides to fight a war, and in Yemen it takes 5 or 6. But really the Arab coalition has been incurring the most damage with the latest that technology has to offer in terms of lethal weaponry. And they are also the stronger party politically and economically. Therefore, if they seriously decide to end this war with American support and with the US putting its diplomatic weight behind such an effort, then I, for one, consider that the chances of success would be considerable. I think Yemenis are not as split as the Lebanese have been on the Trump-Biden thing. Anecdotally and from following social media, I think most Yemenis don't see much good in a Trump administration continuing. They've seen the destruction, the disease, the poverty, and the total insensitivity of this administration to the human suffering in Yemen. They hope, and I've heard directly from leaders of various factions in Yemen, that they have a sincere hope that a Biden presidency will be different, that it will show sensitivity to their suffering, and that it will actually use its weight to move from the sidelines to a strong, direct diplomatic role in Yemen. Up to now, I think the international mediation of Griffiths and company at the UN has been futile, wasting time on the margins and not tackling the main problem of stopping the war. The region and the international community simply have not had the serious will of and desire of ending the war. The region, because it has its own interests that it's trying to accomplish in Yemen, regardless of what devastation that causes. And the international community, because frankly, the US and Europe, most of Europe, have been selling weapons and making huge profits from this war. And so Martin Griffiths goes here and there, and then in the end tells us, oh, this is a Yemeni war and the Yemenis have to seriously want peace. Are you kidding me? I mean, are the Yemenis really free agents and can make a decision when half the world is already on top of them inside Yemen and around Yemen? If Europe and the US and Saudi Arabia and the UAE do not decide to end this war, it will never end. And Martin Griffiths should be shuttling back and forth between Western capitals and Riyadh and the UAE rather than putting the blame on the shoulders of the Yemenis.
Nabil, could we
Yeah.
please wrap it up? Thank
Right.
you.
So, I mean, in a sentence, I think there are problems and prospects with a Biden presidency in the Middle East. There are serious opportunities to do well and to bring peace and stability to the region, but there are also drawbacks, and it's a toss-up at this point whether they'll be able to do good and fulfill the promise that we all have been done. And that's it.
Thank you, Nabil, very much. Appreciate it. If you can just turn your mic off, please. And Yusuf, the mic is yours.
Good morning, and thank you to you all for your comments. I know I share a tremendous resonance with much of what both of you had to say. I'm tasked with addressing the question of a Biden administration and Israel-Palestine policy and what that may look like. And you know, I think to begin to think about what Israel-Palestine policy might look like, we need to think a little bit about foreign policy in general in a Biden administration and where that sort of fits in the priorities of an administration. I think it's important for us in this vein to be very realistic about the current conditions and reality in which a Biden administration is coming into power. Today in the news, for example, we saw that 48 out of 50 US states are now at a stage of uncontrolled spread of the coronavirus. And this continues to be the most dominant issue in the United States and on the global stage as well. It's consequently led to an unprecedented economic collapse that a new administration is going to have to confront. We saw as well yesterday that the president-elect is going to be nominating for chief of staff or appointing as his chief of staff, you know, an individual who had previously served in the Obama administration and been tasked with the administration's Ebola response. And I think that, you know, signals the focus of this administration, and I think rightly so. So given what we know about all of the domestic challenges between the virus and the economic situation, not to mention a legislative agenda that was a lesser part of the campaign that the administration would like to try to move forward, where then is the bandwidth for foreign policy, and where within that bandwidth is there space for Israel-Palestine? I think this is a really important question to help us zero in on what is possible and what is realistic to expect. And I think, you know, one of the things that we should take into consideration, particularly on the question of Israel-Palestine, is the role of domestic politics, because as we know, the Israeli-Palestinian issue in US policy is unique among many other foreign policy issues, precisely because of the extent to which domestic political dynamics shape and condition US policy in that direction. So the domestic dimension is important. And it's not just important because of Israel-Palestine, but also because of this bandwidth question. And I would direct everyone's attention to the date of January 5th, which is the date in which there is going to be a runoff election in the state of Georgia, which will likely determine the balance of power in the US Senate and consequently in the legislative branch overall. I would imagine that a Biden administration that has a cooperative legislative branch is going to take a completely different approach to priorities than one that is going to be facing constant obstacles from a Senate led potentially by Mitch McConnell. If that is the case, if he gets a combative legislative branch instead of a cooperative one, he may very well choose to prioritize some foreign policy issues because there will be less space to work on the domestic front. If that's not the case, it's hard to imagine how as much political capital as he has would be spent on trying to advance a domestic agenda in the time that he has it. So this, I think, is a date that looms large and will shape a lot moving forward. I think also it's important to keep in mind, as Nabil mentioned, that one of the top priorities on the foreign policy agenda that's been mentioned by the Biden campaign and others is re-entering the Iran deal. There's an important window to keep in mind there in 2021. There are scheduled elections, or at least expected elections, in Iran in the summer, which may very well bring about a different presidency in Iran that might complicate the approach that the United States has towards re-entering this deal. It's also important to keep in mind that the dynamics around those negotiations have changed significantly. The United States has defected from an agreement, it's split from its partners, and obviously its posture towards Iran over the last 4 years is not going to be forgotten by the Iranians. So they will approach the negotiating table at a different position than they did previously, and that too might complicate things. The reason that I think the Iranian question is important when it comes to Israel-Palestine policy is because these questions have been linked within the domestic component. The political capital that the president ends up expending on advancing Iran is often thought of in similar ways as the political capital that they would spend on the Israel-Palestine issue, because it is seen as part of the pro-Israel question. Moves towards Iran are going to be criticized by some of the same actors that are going to criticize any attempt to seek a just peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So there is this question of, even if you engage on foreign policy, how much political capital are you willing to expend when it comes to confronting some of the difficult domestic political actors that are going to make your life very difficult as president for doing so. All that being said, let us assume that things break in the direction of a Biden administration determining to engage to some extent on Israel-Palestine, what that might look like. I think we should think here about where the Obama administration, which of course President-elect Biden was vice president in, where they started off and where they left off, and how different that is than the moment that we are at today. Of course, the Obama administration came into office in January of 2009, following a last-ditch effort by the Bush administration to advance some peace process under the framework of a two-state solution in the Annapolis Conference, but also in the immediate aftermath of the devastating Israeli bombardment of the war on Gaza, just before the beginning of the Obama administration. The Israeli-Palestinian issue was at the top of global headlines, and the Obama administration began to engage, for whatever one thinks of the approach that they took, immediately by appointing, I believe on the first or second day of the administration, a special envoy in George Mitchell to begin engaging on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That is a very different place than the place that we are in today. The Israeli-Palestinian issue is not at the top of the international agenda. In fact, it's not even near the middle of the Arab agenda as far as Arab governments go and their priorities. So a Biden administration is going to be looking at that in a very different way than the Obama administration did. The Obama administration came to an end, of course, with UN Resolution 2334 at the United Nations, where after 8 years of efforts to engage on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, they essentially threw their hands up in frustration and made clear that the two-state solution is on its way out in severe danger. The language of the resolution that the Obama administration abstained on said that there was essentially a one-year timeline beyond which the two-state solution would no longer be possible. And in the 4 years that followed, of course, we've seen a Trump administration that has taken more steps and more aggressive steps than any administration previously to bury the prospects of a two-state solution far, far into the ground. So if you are a Biden administration looking to engage on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you are doing so in a very, very different place than the last Democratic administration did. You're looking at Israeli-Palestinian leaderships that are not in a position to move the ball forward. You're looking at an Israeli prime minister that has dedicated himself to engaging in American domestic politics and alienated Democrats in ways that have been unprecedented, and very likely in the short term, Israeli elections at some point in early 2021. Add to this the fact that Joe Biden is not a politician who has been personally inclined to take risks on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in his political stances previously. And I think it's very clear that we are not going to see very much from the Biden administration on Israel-Palestine. But even if they were to engage, what would they be able to do? I think that there is a hope among many that Biden administration may be able to come in and unflip the switch that the Trump administration spent 4 years putting into place. But I think that is a very sort of naive hope, because a lot of what has taken place in the last 4 years is not easily reversible. And even the things that are more easily reversible are not going to be simple and are complicated by American law as well, which has changed over the last several years, specifically as it relates to funding of the Palestinian Authority. We have now in place the Taylor Force Act, which did not exist in the previous administration, as well as other measures which are going to complicate even the executive's space in trying to change back from Trump some of the things that were in place before. So I think if there is going to be any change during a Biden administration on the Israel-Palestine front, it's not going to be something that's going to come from the top at all. They are not motivated to do so, nor are the conditions in place for that to happen. And if there's going to be change, it's change that is going to come either because of the dynamics on the ground in Israel-Palestine, pushing the issue back onto the international agenda, or really changing the dynamics in the region to the point where Arab states reprioritize the issue, or through global civil society helping to push the United States or other states or other international actors in the direction of trying to prioritize this again. But to sum up, I think the cards are stacked quite heavily against seeing the Biden administration do anything beyond that. So I'll leave my comments there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Yusuf, may I just ask you to add just one or two more minutes to talk about the normalization deals?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, but very much like the American recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the American recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, there are going to be certain things that the Biden administration is going to look at as changes that have happened that they're just going to sort of accept, and reversing them, whatever they might think of them, is going to be far more difficult. It's hard to imagine a Biden administration coming in and finding any way to speak negatively about a Israeli normalization agreement with Arab actors, where there may be space to create change within those agreements is on the terms that may have been agreed to by the Trump administration around weapons transfers and around the specific sort of details of agreements with different states. And I think, of course, we saw some news this week about the size of the weapons transfers that were authorized by the Trump administration to the UAE in particular, something like 50 F-35s. I think that is going to be tied up in some domestic challenges for a while before it moves forward. And that's a place where I think a Biden administration may seek to get involved. And obviously with Sudan and Bahrain, I think the details of the terms in those agreements are probably a little bit less known, but those are the places where there may be intervention from the next administration to create any change. If the agreements themselves roll back because of that, that might be a secondary effect, but I don't think that will be the objective of a Biden administration. I think it's important to keep in mind that Biden himself is a self-declared Zionist. His politics throughout the years that he's been in the US Senate have always been far, far closer to the right of the pro-Israel side than even the left of the Zionist side in the United States. So I would not expect him to devote any personal specific energy to changing things in a better direction.
Thank you, Yusuf. And now we have Sarah Leah Whitson joining us. Welcome. And Sarah will be discussing a potential Biden administration policy towards Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Sarah, microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And always good to hear Yusuf's remarks. In terms of President Biden-elect's election, I think there's good news and there's bad news for those of us who aspire to a rights-respecting democratic future for the Middle East. The good news, and of course the biggest big news that can't be underestimated, is kicking Trump out of office. But the good news is that there is a broad and strong consensus among the incoming administration that the excesses of the Trump administration in the Gulf, particularly his excessive romance with Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, must be curbed. There has been a rare show of bipartisan support to end US participation in the war in Yemen and to halt arms sales, which have been avoided only by Trump's vetoes. Outrage over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi also helped fuel the arms sales votes because Mohammed bin Salman was just too bloody and sadistic a ruler to befriend, too impulsive, reckless, and destructive to arm. So I don't think this is a decision that a bipartisan Congress made easily. Biden himself has made clear and unequivocal promises to end arms sales and reassess the relationship with Saudi Arabia in particular. I find myself quoting and requoting, tweeting and retweeting his words from the 2019 Democratic debate, because I think it will be important for us to cite them when we push for implementation. And I want to read them again, just to have them on the record one more place. Yes, I will punish senior Saudi leaders. Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered, and I believe on the order of the Crown Prince. I would make it very clear we are not going to sell more weapons to them, Saudi Arabia. We are going to make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There is very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sales of material to the Saudis who are going in and murdering children in Yemen and murdering innocent people, and they should be held accountable. Sadly, Biden wasn't as clear and unequivocal in subsequent statements. Not on his campaign website, where his foreign policy section has no section or even mention of the Middle East or Saudi Arabia, certainly nothing on arms sales, but does mention ending our support for the war in Yemen. Nor was Biden clear in his most recent statement on the anniversary of Jamal's murder on October 2, where he stated, and I'm quoting again, "We will reassess our relationship with the kingdom and US support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, and make sure America does not check its values at the door to sell arms or buy oil." So call me a nitpicker, but I noted there again the absence of any clear commitment to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, the language is strong in terms of supporting democracies and strengthening relationships with countries that respect democracy and rights. So I'd say that days of warm embrace and orb touching with dictators of the region is over, and there will be a return to a more formalistic relationship with certainly a lot of strong words. It means we as a civil society, advocacy groups, think tanks, journalists, government officials from other countries will be able to return to the days of knocking on the doors of the executive branch, the State Department, NSC, to lobby for the release of detainees, get statements issued condemning an egregious abuse, and certainly won't see those public displays of affection with the current leadership in Saudi Arabia. The second most important piece of good news, at least as important as the first, is that a Biden presidency dramatically reduces the likelihood of war with Iran if we can manage to avoid that in the waning months of the Trump administration. Biden has said he is going to resume the JCPOA nuclear agreement, which I don't think the Iranians are actually going to accept as is, and push for a regional dialogue. A new agreement, which is what it will be in the best case scenario, will mean the dramatic reduction of sanctions on Iran, which will certainly be life-savingly good news for the people of Iran. It will help restore US relationships with European partners, where the issue of Iran increasingly became a dividing issue. And I think Biden will make clear to Israel, Saudi, and the UAE that the US will not support them in a war with Iran. Avoiding a new war in the Middle East will, of course, be a good thing, first and foremost, for the people of the Middle East, including Israelis, Emiratis, Saudis, and Iranians, whose men, women, and children will have the most to lose if bombs start flying across the region. And I always want to remind people of an anecdote I once heard Foreign Minister Zarif made, which is that Emiratis themselves probably have the most to gain from avoiding a war, particularly those very tall and easily targetable skyscrapers in Dubai. But it's complicated, like all things in the Middle East, and even holding Biden to his promises, even getting him to act on sentiments of disgust at Saudi Arabia's worst abuses, even avoiding war with Iran or avoiding trade-offs to satisfy those in the region pissed off about a deal with Iran will not be easy. It wasn't easy for Obama, even though in his personal sympathies, he hated the tyrants as much as we do, was critical of Israel's policies, aspired to democracy and human rights, avoided a foolish military intervention in Syria, and made it a priority to secure a nuclear agreement with Iran. Despite this, he greenlighted and joined the war in Yemen and massively increased US military sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This was payback for the Iran deal, of course, but it created disasters of its own, certainly for the people of Yemen and for nurturing the monster that today is MBS. So that's where the bad news comes in, which I think falls into three buckets. Number one, Biden's personal political philosophy and approach to the Middle East is not progressive. He is not focused on the Middle East, doesn't have a particular nuanced view of the Middle East. Though he's indicated a desire to pivot away from the Middle East, he generally sees the region through the old school lens of American privacy and interventionism, that the United States can and should control and dictate what happens in the region, including, for example, not only supporting the Iraq war, but advocating for Iraq's partition. Some of us are keeping track here of what happens over the past decades. More importantly, he will face the siren call of grossly profitable arms sales to the Gulf's petrodollars and the pressure the arms industry will bring to bear on any measure to cut arms sales. Finally, he's now going to face pressure from Israel, which is now a greater part of the Gulf equation than at any previous time. They will advocate against any punitive measures against Saudi Arabia or the UAE, or even a cooling of relations, regardless of their abuses. As a result, I doubt Biden will seek to proactively cut arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or even the pending deal to the UAE, which, by the way, even if signed now, can be suspended under a Biden administration. The genius of the UAE-Israel-Bahrain Accord, probably likely soon to include Saudi Arabia, is that it tethers the United States to the Gulf states via Israel. Just as Egypt and Jordan have been tethered to the United States via their peace deals with Israel, just as they have benefited now for decades with lucrative quid pro quo arms, our perennial gift from US taxpayers to Egyptian dictators and Jordanian kings for making peace with Israel, now so too the UAE, Bahrain, and soon Saudi will insist and likely receive, at least under Biden, automatic tethering to the United States via their deals with Israel, via arms sales that Israel will not protest and will grease the wheels of industry and lobbying here in the United States. The UAE, or rather Mohammed bin Zayed, didn't get anything for the Palestinians in its arms deal, the so-called Abraham Accords, of course. And it didn't just get arms, though MBZ loves those big bombs. What MBZ got, what the UAE really paid for, or used their Palestine chit to pay for, is the new unbreakable tie to the US and US protection via Israel. This relationship is only buttressed by the loyalty and devotion to Israel that Youssef just referred to, that Biden has loudly professed, promising that our ties to Israel are unwavering, unshakable, unconditional, you name the it's there. So while Biden will not veto legislation to ban arms sales, I think that would be politically too taxing for him, I doubt he will proactively seek to make it happen. He can pressure the popular sentiment to force the Saudis to end the war in Yemen, which would really just be a favor to Saudi, giving them a face-saving way out of the war. I'm certain he won't pressure the UAE to withdraw its control of Socotra Island in Yemen, where it has set up a surveillance base with Israel, or otherwise seek to control South Yemen. Even on an issue as narrow and apparently limited in scope as Jamal Khashoggi's murder, I don't see Biden taking aggressive, proactive steps, though I hope I'm wrong. Let's think about the Department of National Intelligence report that implicates Mohammed bin Salman in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The US Congress demanded that President Trump and the State Department release that report and make it public to Congress. The Trump administration has refused. Only under great pressure did they even release a classified version of that report. There is now litigation pending to force the administration to release this report. A new President Biden can release that report with the stroke of a pen. Will he move to release it? I doubt it, because it will just make impossible ongoing relations with MBS, with someone who's a verified murderer in a public report that the entire United States will see. I think the real first test for Biden will he block the release of the report? How will he respond to a lawsuit that's likely to drag on into his administration? So that's the good news and the bad news, my take on the situation. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss this with you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate the comments. And thanks for joining us, although a bit late, but welcome anyway. I have a question that is going to be that I'm going to split between Sahar and Sarah, and it has to do with lobbying. Egypt, it was announced a couple of days ago that Egypt has really formed some sort of a really tough team, bipartisan team for lobbying efforts in Washington. What do you think this will really do? And for Sarah, what is to be expected from a Saudi or Gulf-friendly lobbying community in Washington, D.C.? Sahar, you're first.
Thank you. Well, lobbying by foreign states is nothing new, and lobbying by Middle East regimes is nothing new. So it may be getting some coverage just because of the nervousness that Egypt is experiencing, and I think it should, because Trump was so far to the extreme or to the right in terms of his just open support for dictatorship, as an aspiring dictator himself. So I think one of the positive aspects of the Trump administration is that it lay bare and it made it very explicit what many of us already knew, but for the American public that wasn't paying attention or that was more willing to fall for the liberalism speak of the Democrats, I think what Trump did is he exposed what American foreign policy has always been. And so I think what it is it's notice to those who, the young people, the progressives, hopefully the liberals that will become more progressive or have become more progressive, that this is an adversarial process, and that it's better to have this dispute or resolve this dispute through lobbying rather than through war. So I think it's really about what are we going to do in response to that. There are some legal mechanisms that could be what we'll call maybe offensive, as in defense, offense, is should we as a country allow these foreign countries to have these lobbies? Should there be limitations and restrictions on such lobbying, not just for Egypt or Middle East regimes, but it's highly problematic that foreign countries can interfere in our domestic affairs through money in a very open way. So that's one issue that hopefully, something that's systemic, not just unique to Egypt, but it's just more evidence of the corruption of our domestic politics through foreign country lobbying. And then the other is more because of the defense or the response, which is investing in the counter lobbying and realizing this is just one more sign that lobbying by civil society, call it lobbying, call it advocacy, call it civic engagement, there's different forms, but that it is even more important for those, whether you're a private citizen or you work at a think tank or you work in, within the government, is that the other side is using its money, money that is stolen from its people through corruption, in order to continue these practices that keep them in power and keep them able to continue to oppress their people and steal the money of their countries. And I think that's what's so sick about the entire process. So I guess I would just end by saying, focus on both the offensive of trying to restrain and changing these laws that where money is corrupting our political system, both by domestic lobbyists, but even more so by foreign governments, and also ensure that there is the space and the support for us to respond in kind with facts, because I think the facts are on human rights advocates' side. I think that if you're focused on the facts, and we are in fact serious about our human rights commitments, and we are honest about it and say, yes, we do believe in human rights, the facts are on our side.
Thanks, Sahar. Sarah?
I mean, I really just echo what Sahar says, to point out that obviously Egypt is deeply invested in the corrupt American political system that allows influence buying. That's not new, and so it's no surprise that they have hustled to get democratically aligned lobbyists on their team. I think in terms of new legislation, the only way to save our republic is to limit the role of lobbyists, and more importantly, limit the role of the revolving door of government officials who go on to become lobbyists. Like Mr. Nadim El-Shami, who used to be Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff, but now is the lobbyist for the criminal Egyptian government. And, I don't know how this man goes to sleep at night. I don't know how he faces his children in the morning. And I can't think of a worse, job to have than to be papering over this government's abuses with the Biden administration. But this is an endemic corruption in our government, and it never ceases to surprise me how every government in the world, no matter how poor or small, Burkina Faso is hiring lobbyists in Washington to lobby for humanitarian aid, and Mozambique is looking for lobbyists to help get disaster relief. That everyone feels that they have to get in on the game of corruption. And it seems like every government has influence and say about what our government does, more than the American people do, certainly more than their own peoples do. So this is a very, very big problem. And it's why even progressive-minded political leaders, even a President Biden who might share disgust and abhorrence at what some of these governments do, is impeded in taking active measures.
Thanks, Sarah. I have a question from Mireille Phillips, and I don't know to whom to ask, so I just chose Nabil Khouri to answer. The Trump administration emphasized religious freedom policy towards Middle East Christians. Obviously, it can be debated how beneficial or disastrous it actually was for Middle East Christians. How do you suspect U.S. policy towards MENA Christians will change under a Biden administration? Mike? Mike?
Yes, tough question, because I think there's always been a bias under successive administrations for the rights of Christians as a minority, an important minority for the US. And of course, all minorities are important, and religious freedom should be a goal of US policy in the region. But sometimes it's ridiculous when the majority's rights are being trampled and we say nothing, but then we say, oh, rush to save the Christian communities, whether it's in Iraq or Syria, or for that matter, the Jewish community in Yemen. I think the pressure on Biden, again, I repeat, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will be focused a bit on that. To some extent, you shoot yourself in the foot when you look at the Christian minority especially, and it looks in the region as if the Christian minority is tethered to Western powers abusing the rights of the majority. This goes way back, by the way. I mean, it is not Trump, it is not even previous administrations, but historically. I mean, the French colonial rule, focused on the Christians and giving Christians power in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region. Christians need to mend their fences with the majorities in the region to be better protected by their own communities. And I think we do everybody a service, including the Christians, by focusing on democracy, good governance, and the observance of human rights for all.
Thanks, Nabil. This question is for Yusuf from Ahmed Nabil at Wayne State University. The Trump administration has tried to actually promote regional alliances between Arab and Israel, between Arab states and Israel against Iran, specifically against Iran. How do you think the Biden administration is going to be looking at that specific angle?
I'm not sure that I would agree with the premise of the question. I mean, obviously, the Trump administration has sought to bring some of these ties out into the open in a more formal way. I think primarily the Trump administration has done that for a couple reasons. One, because there has been a committed group of pro-Israel ideologues very close to the President of the United States that have sought to advance a very specific pro-Israel agenda from the outset of the Trump administration, and have frankly been successful in many ways in doing so precisely because they've been able to make the case to the President of the United States of the sort of domestic political utility that some of these moves would have for him, particularly in keeping his base of white evangelicals energized ahead of an election. But I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that these alliances, if we're going to use that word, at least in terms of military assets and whatnot, have always, prior to the Trump administration, been aligned in the same direction. So it's not, it's more of an issue of formalization of ties, which has some political purpose for both Trump administration and for the Israelis. But in terms of actual material balance, not a whole lot has changed. Obviously, we'll see what comes of the arms transfers that are part of the terms here, which may actually change certain things. But I don't see this as a shift in alliances. These alliances are pre-existing. What's come out now is that we've seen more of it in public. And in many ways, I would even challenge the notion that these alliances coming out into the public is somehow bad for the Iranians. I think actually the Iranians will find ways to manipulate and take advantage of this in the ways that they've often been successful in doing in their messaging throughout the Arab world.
Okay, thanks, Yusuf. Sahar, this is a question from our friend Greg Afterdinian. How does the United States support civil society activists in Egypt when the regime itself will likely block any U.S. assistance to them?
Right, and that is the heart of the NGO law. And that's, so for those who don't know, there's been multiple iterations of this law, but I think the latest one in 2017 put very strict conditions and restrictions on NGOs, non-government organizations in Egypt from taking money from any foreign source, and essentially legalized the surveillance and micromanagement of NGOs by the state. So this is an example of lawfare, and one of the things that Egypt does very well, has a very sophisticated legal system that was adopted inherited or adopted based on the French system, is the Egyptian regime has been very good at using law, right, to legitimize repression, but at the same time selectively deciding when to enforce, when not to enforce, and oftentimes based on political motivations. So that is a fair question. This is where I think diplomacy and political power comes in. Look, the US is in somewhat of a difficult spot. On the one hand, there are concerns that in Egypt and in other foreign countries that civil society is a guise for the CIA, right? That essentially what this is the intelligence services or the US government using Egyptian civil society to manipulate domestic politics, right? Foreign intervention in domestic politics, and then you bring in sovereignty issues. And knowing what we know about colonialism and post-colonialism, these are not radical conspiracy theories. There is truth to foreign intervention, particularly by the West. The question is I think the more transparency you have in the process, the harder it is for the conspiracy theorists to use the conspiracy theories or history to then quash legitimate civil society in Egypt. Because there are, and those of us who know Egypt or any other Middle East country, there are indigenous human rights activists, native human rights activists who, it's not Western or Eastern, right? Human rights is not a Western or Eastern concept. It's not a Christian or Muslim concept. These are why we call them universal rights. So I think we need more transparency on the one hand to make sure that it's very clear that if the regime tries to vilify civil society, which is a very common form of state propaganda, in order to get the people to be against them, right, to make them seem that they're these foreign agents, that there's transparency and that they can say, this is where we got the money, this is how we use the money, and this is how we are actually serving the Egyptian people, and no, we are not these foreign agents. The second is, I think that the US government has to use its power, its political power, its diplomatic power, and essentially expect that from Egypt is not so much let us control your civil society, because that's unacceptable, but whether it's us or the Europeans or China or any other country, but as long as there's transparency and as long as the NGOs are following a law that is not politically motivated to repress civil society or to repress political opposition, then the Egyptian government is about creating space. So it's really about expectations, and it's following up on those expectations, because what Middle East regimes, particularly Egypt, I think is a good example, but there are other countries, they're very good at calling America's bluff. We say we support human rights, we say we have the Leahy Act, we talk a lot of bluster, but they know that at the end of the day, we get scared, our government backs off and buckles when there's threats of, well, if you push back on me, the country's going to fall apart, there's going to be instability, we're going to have chaos. And what I think the message needs to be clear to the Biden people, and they don't have an excuse. The Obama people, maybe you could arguably say they had an excuse, but you've been put on notice, Biden administration, when you allow, support, and produce these repressive conditions in the Middle East, you are contributing to another revolution. Right? And that is going to create more instability. And yes, more Middle Easterners are going to die and suffer, but to the extent we all care about political stability in the region, and if even the hawks care about that, this is the most foolish foreign policy agenda that you could think of, right? So I think it's doable. It's just a matter of having the will and following through and being consistent.
Thank you, Sahar. Sarah, I'd like you to touch a little bit on the issue of female and male opposition figures in jail in Saudi Arabia. What is the latest on that?
Well, I mean, the latest are two things. One is that the Saudi government bizarrely leaked the trial balloon that it would grant women detainees in Saudi Arabia, like Loujain al-Hathloul, I presume like Samar Badawi, clemency or pardon, because they recognized, and this is the Saudi ambassador to the UK, that the PR cost of detaining them was just too high. So there was a good deal of hope that they would at least be released, if not travel banned. Still, in the build up to the G20, which has been very difficult for Saudi Arabia, just a daily swat at their record opened up by the opportunity of the G20, with people like Joseph Stiglitz using his opening remarks for the T20 to lambast the Saudi government. However, today, the Saudi Arabia denied to the BBC that this was on the table. So I don't know what that means for their little trial balloon. It is going to be a difficult sell for the Saudi government, which has invested so much domestic resources in vilifying these women activists in particular as traitors and so forth, to now say, well, nah, okay, we're going to pardon them. But clearly that is the demand of the international community, and Saudi Arabia recognizes very clearly that there will be no return to normal in terms of its pariah status or shaking that, so long as these women, for whom there's tremendous global sympathy, remain detained. The other very sad development, but a development nonetheless, is that about 2 weeks ago, there was meant to be a hearing for Salman al-Odeh, who is probably the country's most famous, well-known, widely followed religious reformer, who's called for democratization, who's called for a constitutional monarchy over the years, who's been very critical of the Saudi government. He has been detained for over 2 years now. Over 1 year, no hearing. This was supposed to be his first hearing date after 1 year in detention on charges for which he faces the death penalty. And again, the Saudi government delayed and postponed the hearing. So if anything, that's an indication that the Saudi government doesn't really feel the need to take any measurable steps to release the pressure, to release unjustly detained people in the Middle East. And my own prediction is that after the G20, there will be an expanded wave of arrests, going deeper into the royal circle as the time for a transition to MBS to try to become king nears. Because I think what we have to understand is that the thing that MBS is more afraid of than probably anything else is his own citizens, his own people. Those are the people he feels compelled to silence and to quash. He doesn't mind taking advice from PR advisors. He doesn't mind taking advice from McKinsey's and Jared Kushner and all the internationals, telling him what they should do in Neom, in building this modernistic city. He doesn't want to hear from his own people. That's what terrifies him.
Very sad story instead, indeed. Yusuf, two questions. One from Sophia Arman, who says, how can we make sure we do not allow the Democrats to normalize the acceleration of the colonization of Palestine and continue to push them harder? Another one from our Abdul Wahab al-Qassab, who asks, Biden, it's difficult to see how Biden will be dealing with the issue of recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. How about the Golan Heights?
Yeah, if I could just take them in reverse order, I see it very hard to imagine how Biden administration is going to reverse any of the recognition decisions. I think they're going to see these as bells that have been rung that they cannot unring, that are a part of the sort of expectations of what would happen at the end of comprehensive agreements, and that it doesn't really make sense to sort of reverse course on this. And frankly, this has been a pattern within U.S. history where the Israelis lay claim to something, whatever it might be, a small piece of territory, a large piece of territory, claim a certain status over a territory, and after years of rhetorical American objection, there is an ultimate, acceptance by the Americans because so much time has passed and facts on the ground are what they are. We've seen this in Jerusalem, we've seen this with settlements, and so on and so forth. So I don't think Biden is going to break from that mold. And I think there are going to be plenty of voices around him who are going to say, look, if we decide to reverse a position on Golan or on Jerusalem or on anything else, what are we getting for it, and how does it serve the bigger purpose? And you know, it's not really clear what those answers are. You know, if you are trying to make the case for connecting this to some sort of peace process objective, when the peace process and the two-state solution are as dead as a doornail. You know, so I think the incentives are going to be to really not touch this as much as possible, knowing the kind of political animal that Biden is, and the people around him, the voices around him are likely going to be. And that brings us to the answer to the second question. Look, the reality is there are voices today in the Democratic Party that are much better on some of these issues than we've seen in many years, and they are more receptive and open to civil society efforts and pressure and engagement than many of their predecessors have been. Nabil mentioned some of these folks, but there's a turning tide now, a new generation of leaders who I think have a different perspective on how politics is done, how engagement with the electorate happens, fundraising models that look different, and think about their interests fundamentally differently than some of their predecessors. And this has created space, I think, for engagement for communities, like communities of people who care about Palestinian rights, who've long felt that there is no space for them within the political process. I think that has started to change, and there's opportunity now, even if not at the highest levels of government, but within the legislative branch, to continue to push for initiatives that lend to a more just outcome than we've seen at any time prior.
Thanks, Yusuf. Nabil, I'd like you to also comment on this issue of the Golan. Your diplomatic experience can really help try to shed some lights on it. I also have a question for you from William Lawrence. Do you think the Biden administration will apply the bandwidth needed to support Tunisia and Sudan's fragile democratic transition and the opening Libyan political talks towards hopefully a similar end?
Okay. I have no hopes at all that anything will be done on the Golan Heights. This goes back to Bill Clinton and the meeting in Geneva between him and Hafez al-Assad, which I attended, and where this was a big issue for Hafez al-Assad, and where Bill Clinton could not do anything about it, could not do anything to satisfy his desire to get back this piece of territory. The issue after '94 doesn't even come up. I think that the idea of a new administration, again, I go back to Biden when he was vice president, and how the Obama administration dealt with territories in general. The first year, I mean, Yusuf mentioned the appointment of George Mitchell, which was very hopeful. I mean, I personally thought that if anybody could do it, George Mitchell could bring back some real peace talks that would achieve something. But the effort of George Mitchell lasted a year, and I was at the department, and my office was supplying information on that they required from us, the Mitchell team, in terms of maps of settlements and the sizes and populations of settlements. And unfortunately, they went to the bazaar with the Israelis about the size of settlements and how many houses can you have in a settlement. And we told them, we said, if you go into that souk, basically you have given up that they can continue with these settlements. either you mean what you say when you say zero growth, stop right there and start rolling back. Or if you enter into each settlement and how many people can live in it, then you've lost the battle, which is what happened. Then Mitchell gave up. And then for the next 3 years, nothing was done on Palestinian rights, on Palestinian-Israeli peace. In the second term, Kelly worked on that for a while, again, maybe a year or less. And then they gave up as well. And for the last 3 years of the Obama-Biden administration, they did nothing on the Israel-Palestine question. As I say, during all this, the Golan was not even talked about. So I think there is zero chance of any progress on the Golan Heights. As far as the Israelis are concerned, it's a done deal. They're not willing to budge at all. And I don't see any US administration forcing their hand on that.
And the other question on Tunisia, Sudan, and Libya, any comments?
I wasn't sure how you linked Sudan and Libya to Tunisia, but Tunisia has, been always a positive case of the Arab uprising making a real change without violence, and of the Islamists and secularists reaching an important accord to share power and to work democratically. I think the fact that there was no war in Tunisia like there was in neighboring Libya meant that it was ignored rather than focused on and assisted as a success story. And this is a failure of what we had, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, the support for democracy and for civil society. All that could have easily been done and done in force in Tunisia. It wasn't. And as a result, Tunisia faces serious economic challenges and political tensions as well. Primarily corruption, some of the old regime creeping back in different ways. So I'm afraid for US priorities, this is a failure to put its weight behind a success story, a potentially very successful story. I'm afraid on Libya, there is zero that the Biden administration can do. We're simply out of that game. At least we're no longer putting our weight behind General Haftar, but I don't see us playing a role. The US influence went down to zero. It'll probably stay there. There are other powers, regional and international, now playing their game in Libya. Sudan became, like Yemen, a file belongs in the Saudi files. And it's going to be a challenge to do anything in Sudan without somehow leaning on Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, who use their influence to get Sudan to normalize relations with Israel. This is the last thing that Sudan needs, given all its other problems. But Sudan is a zone where which is used for the conflict in Yemen. It's used for, in fact, Palestine and Israel. Quite often, Iranian weapons made their way to Sudan and then, up through the desert into Sinai, into Palestine. And that's the primary interest that Israel has in Sudan. There's going to be a free hand for Israel and the UAE, partners in a lot of security plots in the region, and Sudan will be one of these arenas. So again, that's an area where I don't see the US being able to change very much of that dynamic, no matter what the intentions and preferences are of Joe Biden.
Thank you, Nabil. Appreciate it. Folks, this is all the time we have today. Thank you to the panelists, Sahar Aziz, Nabil Khouri, Yusuf Nair, and Sarah Leah Whitson. We appreciate your comments, your participation today. Very, very informative panel. Thanks to the audience for joining us today. It's good to remember that there will be a recording of this event online on our website by this afternoon or tomorrow. Thank you again, and please continue to participate in Arab Center DC, Washington DC's events. Thank you. Have a good day and good rest of the week.